The Siege of Paris between the years 885 and 887 stands as one of the most extraordinary and defining episodes in the long and turbulent history of medieval Europe, a moment when the very heart of Francia faced an existential threat from a massive force of Norsemen, arriving in what appeared to be an endless fleet of ships. The image of 700 Viking vessels sailing down the Seine, carrying perhaps as many as 30,000 warriors from the north, is one that has lingered for centuries, not only because of the scale of the event but also because of what it represented. The clash of two worlds, the determination of a fledgling European capital, and the fragile balance of power between kings, nobles, and foreign invaders. To understand the magnitude of the siege, one must first imagine the atmosphere of late 9th century West Francia, the fractured successor state of the Carolingian Empire. The empire of Charlemagne had once spanned much of Europe, binding together territories from the Pyrenees to the Elbe and from the North Sea to the Alps. But by the middle of the 9th century, it had splintered under the pressure of succession crises and external invasions. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided the empire among Charlemagne's grandsons, creating the kingdoms of East, West, and Middle Francia. West Francia, ruled by the descendants of Charles the Bald, was what would eventually become the Kingdom of France. But in the 9th century, it was still a vulnerable land, plagued by internal power struggles and subject to constant raids from Vikings who sailed up its rivers with terrifying ease. Paris, though not yet the mighty capital it would later become, had already grown in importance as a fortified settlement on the Isle de la Cité, the small island in the middle of the Seine that provided natural defensive advantages. A small but strategic city, it had walls, towers, and bridges that could be defended, making it one of the few places capable of resisting Viking fleets that depended on river access. When word spread in late 885 that a Viking fleet of unprecedented size was advancing toward Paris, the panic was immediate and overwhelming. For decades, Vikings had raided coastal towns, monasteries, and river settlements, but never before had such a colossal host assembled with the apparent intention of subduing the very heart of West Francia. Contemporary chronicles describe 700 ships packed with warriors, perhaps numbering 30,000, though some modern historians argue the figure may have been lower. Whether or not the numbers were exaggerated, the sight of hundreds upon hundreds of longships crowding the Seine must have been staggering to the defenders watching from the walls of Paris. The sound of oars striking the water, the rhythmic chants of warriors, and the sheer forest of sails would have struck terror into even the bravest. The leader of this immense Viking force was Siegfried, a seasoned chieftain, accompanied by other notable commanders such as Rollo, who would later go on to establish the Duchy of Normandy. Their goal was clear: to plunder Paris and force Charles the Fat, the Carolingian emperor, into paying tribute. The Vikings had grown accustomed to extracting immense payments of silver and gold from West Francia in exchange for leaving settlements unharmed, and they expected Paris to be no different. Yet this time, the defenders of Paris refused to submit quietly. The city was commanded by Odo, Count of Paris, a determined and resourceful nobleman who would later rise to become King of West Francia. Alongside Bishop Goslin, who played both a spiritual and military role, Odo rallied the citizens, soldiers, and clergy alike to defend their city to the last. They fortified the bridges, repaired the walls, and stockpiled supplies, preparing for what they knew would be a prolonged siege. The first major assault came in late November 885, when the Viking fleet surrounded the city and demanded passage upriver. Odo and Goslin refused, understanding that allowing the Norsemen to pass would mean devastation for the countryside beyond. Enraged, the Vikings launched a ferocious attack, battering the fortifications with stones, fire, and siege engines of their own construction. It is a common misconception to imagine Vikings as merely raiders armed with axes and swords. In reality, they were capable of constructing complex siege equipment, and at Paris they deployed catapults, battering rams and towers in an effort to breach the defenses. The defenders responded with equal ingenuity, hurling stones, boiling oil, and molten wax down upon the attackers. The bridge towers, stoutly constructed and manned by determined soldiers, became the focal point of the struggle. For weeks the Vikings hurled themselves at the defenses, but despite their overwhelming numbers, they were repelled again and again. One of the most legendary episodes of the siege occurred when the Vikings attempted to set fire to the wooden bridge that connected the island to the banks. Braving a hail of missiles, they brought forward bundles of brush and flaming torches, but the defenders poured water and sand upon the flames, beating them back with desperate resolve. The chronicles speak of incredible acts of bravery on both sides, with men fighting until exhaustion overcame them, wounds ignored in the frenzy of combat. Bishop Goslin himself is said to have fought with sword in hand, inspiring the people with both faith and courage. The siege dragged on through the winter, and the suffering within Paris grew severe. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, and the morale of the defenders was sorely tested. Yet Odo managed to slip through the enemy lines on horseback at one point, riding to seek aid from Charles the Fat, who was encamped elsewhere in the empire. The emperor, however, proved indecisive and weak. Rather than rushing to relieve Paris, he delayed, considering negotiations with the invaders and leaving the city to fend for itself. Meanwhile, the Vikings shifted tactics. Realizing that Paris would not fall quickly, they established camps around the city and began ravaging the surrounding countryside. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and monasteries looted. The sight of smoke rising from the horizon would have been a constant reminder to the citizens of Paris of the devastation being wrought outside their walls. Yet despite the hardships, the defenders refused to yield. For more than a year the siege continued, a grueling war of attrition that drained both sides. Eventually, in 886, Charles the Fat finally appeared with an imperial army, but rather than delivering a decisive blow against the Vikings, he chose the path of compromise. He negotiated a deal, paying the invaders a hefty sum of silver and even granting them passage to raid further into Burgundy. To the defenders of Paris, this was nothing short of a betrayal. After enduring starvation, disease, an endless assault, they had expected their emperor to reward their heroism with a resounding victory, not to appease their enemies with tribute. The morale of the empire suffered greatly, and Charles's reputation was irreparably damaged. Odo, on the other hand, emerged from the siege as a hero of almost mythical stature. His leadership, courage, and determination to resist against overwhelming odds inspired the people of Paris and won him immense popularity. When Charles the Fat was deposed in 887, Odo was chosen as king of West Francia, marking the rise of a new dynasty that would eventually shape the course of French history. The siege itself ended inconclusively, with Paris still standing but much of the countryside devastated. The Vikings, though they failed to take the city, had once again demonstrated the weakness of the Carolingian monarchy and the effectiveness of their tactics. Yet the long-term consequences of the siege were profound. It was a turning point in the history of Paris, marking the moment when the city's strategic and symbolic importance became undeniable. The successful defense against such overwhelming odds cemented its role as a center of resistance and resilience. The people of Paris had proven that they could withstand even the mightiest onslaught, and this reputation would contribute to the city's eventual rise as the capital of France. For the Vikings, the siege was both a triumph and a failure. They had secured immense wealth through tribute, but they had been unable to break Paris or to impose lasting control over the heart of West Francia. Yet the events of 885–887 also laid the groundwork for the eventual settlement of Vikings in the region. Rollo, who had fought in the siege, would later accept land in Normandy in exchange for defending the kingdom against future Viking raids. Thus, the very invaders who once sought to destroy Paris would, within a generation, become part of the fabric of French nobility. The siege of Paris, therefore, was more than just a desperate defense against a foreign invasion. It was a pivotal chapter in the transformation of Europe during the early Middle Ages, illustrating the decline of Carolingian central authority, the rise of local leaders like Odo, and the integration of Viking power into the political landscape of France. The image of 700 ships and 30,000 warriors arriving at the gates of Paris may evoke terror, but the true legacy of the siege lies in the resilience of a city and a people who refused to yield, and in the complex interplay of conflict and accommodation that shaped the destiny of a continent. As the centuries passed, the story of the siege was told and retold, embroidered with legend and heroism. Chroniclers spoke of divine intervention, of miraculous survivals, and of the unbreakable faith of the Parisians. Though the numbers may have been exaggerated and the details colored by time, the essence of the tale remained. The day when Paris stood alone against the greatest Viking host ever assembled and endured. The smoke of burning villages, the clash of steel on the bridge towers, the cries of the wounded, and the tolling of church bells mingled in an atmosphere of defiance that would echo down the ages. To the people of West Francia, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, courage and unity could hold back the tide of destruction. To the Vikings, it was a lesson in the limits of power and the difficulty of conquering a determined people on their own soil. The Siege of Paris was thus both a battle and a symbol, a crucible in which the future of France was forged amid fire and blood. It remains one of the most remarkable confrontations of the Viking Age, a testament to the endurance of a city and the indomitable spirit of its defenders. Background of West Francia and Viking threats. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his vast empire began to fragment under the weight of internal divisions and inheritance disputes. By the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the empire split into East, West, and Middle Francia, weakening its ability to repel external enemies. West Francia, the early form of modern France, suffered constant attacks from Viking raiders who had discovered the ease of sailing up its navigable rivers like the Seine and Loire. Monasteries, towns, and trading settlements were repeatedly plundered, leaving the population fearful and demoralized. Unlike isolated raids, the great Viking expeditions of the later 9th century began to resemble organized invasions, targeting wealthier and more strategic centers, setting the stage for Paris to face its greatest trial. Paris in the 9th century. In the 9th century, Paris was not yet the dominant capital of France, but had already developed as a fortified settlement with significant strategic importance. Situated on the Isle de la Cité in the Seine River, the city was protected by natural water barriers and strengthened with walls and towers. 2 wooden bridges connected the island to the riverbanks, vital for defense as well as for commerce. The growing influence of Paris made it an attractive target for Viking raiders seeking riches and leverage. Yet the same geography that lured the Norsemen also provided defensive advantages. Its central location and resilience in previous raids gave Parisians both the burden of constant threat and the pride of being defenders of the realm. Arrival of the Viking fleet. In late 885, news spread of a Viking armada approaching Paris, far greater than anything seen before. Contemporary chroniclers spoke of 700 ships and 30,000 warriors, though modern historians debate the accuracy of those numbers. Even if exaggerated, the sheer size of the fleet was unprecedented. The long serpent-like procession of ships moving up the Seine would have been a terrifying spectacle, their sails and shields glinting in the cold light. Led by powerful chieftains such as Siegfried and the legendary Rollo, the invaders were not merely raiding, but aiming to extract enormous tribute or seize control. The defenders of Paris understood that this was no ordinary raid. It was an existential threat to their survival. Demands and refusal. When the Viking fleet anchored near Paris, its leaders demanded tribute and safe passage upriver. This was a tactic that had succeeded many times before in other towns and monasteries, where terrified leaders bought temporary safety with gold and silver. But in Paris, Count Odo and Bishop Goslin flatly refused the demands. They understood that yielding would open the entire interior of Francia to devastation. The refusal was both a practical military decision and a moral stand, showing the people that surrender was not an option. This act of defiance enraged the Norse commanders, who prepared for direct assault. From that moment, Paris ceased to be just another target. It became the site of a legendary confrontation. Initial assaults. The Vikings launched their first assaults in November 885, bringing forward siege engines such as battering rams, catapults, and even wooden towers, showing that they were more than just marauders. They targeted the wooden bridges and their strong towers, hoping to break through the city's key defenses. The defenders responded with extraordinary determination. Stones, boiling water, burning pitch, and arrows rained down from the battlements. Chronicles describe the smoke and screams that filled the air as waves of Norsemen tried to cross makeshift pontoons under relentless attack. Despite their numbers, the Vikings failed to breach the walls or destroy the bridges in these initial clashes. Paris had shown that it was prepared for a long and brutal resistance. Role of Count Odo and Bishop Goslin. Leadership was crucial during the siege, and Paris had two figures who embodied resistance: Count Odo and Bishop Goslin. Odo organized defenses, distributed food, and personally fought on the walls, inspiring both soldiers and citizens. Bishop Goslin, despite his clerical role, is said to have fought with sword in hand, blurring the line between spiritual leader and warrior. Their combined resolve gave the defenders hope against overwhelming odds. In one daring episode, Odo slipped out of the city on horseback, dodging Viking patrols, to request aid from Emperor Charles the Fat. This audacious ride became legendary, demonstrating his courage. Both Odo and Goslin embodied the spirit of a besieged city determined to hold firm against despair. Suffering inside Paris. As weeks turned into months, life inside Paris grew increasingly desperate. Supplies dwindled and rationing became severe. The cold winter of 885–886 only worsened the misery, and disease began to spread among the crowded population trapped behind the walls. Corpses of the dead, both from battle and illness, piled up, threatening more outbreaks. Yet despite hunger and fear, the defenders continued to resist. Priests led prayers, families helped fortify defenses, and soldiers endured exhaustion. The psychological toll was immense, but the community's unity under Odo's leadership helped sustain morale. For the Parisians, survival itself became an act of defiance. Every day they held out against the Norsemen strengthened the city's determination to endure, whatever the cost. Charles the Fat's indecisive leadership. While Paris fought valiantly, Emperor Charles the Fat's role proved disastrous. He was slow to respond to Odo's appeals for reinforcements, preoccupied with other matters in his fractured empire. When he finally mustered an imperial army in 886, hope soared among the defenders that their suffering would be rewarded with liberation. Instead, Charles shocked everyone by negotiating with the invaders. He paid them a large sum of silver and even allowed them to march south to raid Burgundy. To the citizens of Paris, who had endured months of hunger and attack, this was nothing short of betrayal. Charles's failure to deliver decisive military action shattered his authority, and his reputation never recovered, hastening his eventual downfall. The Viking devastation of the countryside. While Paris resisted behind its walls, the surrounding countryside bore the brunt of Viking fury. Unable to break into the city quickly, the Norse warriors turned their energy outward, raiding villages, burning crops, and looting monasteries. Smoke from burning settlements rose daily on the horizon, visible to those inside Paris as a reminder of the destruction around them. Peasants fled for their lives, and entire regions were stripped of wealth. This strategy served both as punishment for Paris's defiance and as a means to sustain the invaders with food and supplies. The scale of devastation was immense, leaving scars that lasted for generations. For the people of West Francia, the countryside became a wasteland haunted by Viking terror. The stalemate and agreement. After more than a year of inconclusive struggle, the siege reached a stalemate. The Vikings, though powerful, could not break the stubborn defenses of Paris. The Parisians, though heroic, faced starvation and exhaustion. When Charles the Fat finally arrived, hopes of a decisive battle rose, but instead he struck a deal. The invaders received tribute and permission to raid Burgundy, ending the immediate threat but leaving Paris bitter. The agreement highlighted both the weakness of central Carolingian authority and the futility of relying on imperial power for protection. For Paris, the victory was bittersweet. They had survived, but only through their own endurance, while their supposed ruler effectively rewarded the enemy for devastation and bloodshed. Aftermath and Odo's rise. Though Charles the Fat's actions demoralized many, Odo's reputation soared. He had become the hero of Paris, the embodiment of courage and resilience. When Charles was deposed in 887, Odo was elected king of West Francia, marking a pivotal moment in French history. His ascent symbolized the growing power of local rulers who defended their lands when imperial authority faltered. The Siege of Paris became his defining legacy, proof that leadership, bravery, and unity could succeed where politics failed. The defenders who had survived famine and fire now celebrated Odo as their savior. His reign marked the beginning of a shift from Carolingian imperial rule toward the rise of local dynasties that shaped medieval France. Impact on Viking strategies. For the Vikings, the siege was both victory and failure. They had extracted immense tribute, secured supplies, and devastated wide regions. Yet they had failed to conquer Paris itself, despite overwhelming numbers. This experience revealed the limitations of their strategies when facing determined defenders in fortified cities. Over time, Norse leaders began to recognize that settlement and integration offered greater rewards than endless raiding. Paris demonstrated that not every prize could be seized through brute force alone. The lesson was not lost on men like Rollo, who would later abandon raiding in favor of establishing lasting power within Francia. Thus, the siege marked a turning point in Viking tactics, pushing them toward more permanent political roles. The road to Normandy. Among the Viking leaders at the siege was Rollo, a figure who would later leave an indelible mark on French history. Though unable to take Paris, he and his followers eventually negotiated with the French crown to settle in the region that became Normandy. Granted land and titles in exchange for defending against further raids, Rollo and his successors transformed from feared raiders into Dukes of Normandy. This arrangement not only stabilized northern Francia, but also began a process of assimilation. Viking warriors married into local families, adopted Christianity, and became part of the feudal system. The Siege of Paris, thus, indirectly paved the way for the creation of Normandy, bridging the worlds of Norsemen and Franks. Symbolic importance of the siege. The successful defense of Paris had a powerful symbolic effect, both for the city itself and for West Francia as a whole. Despite betrayal by their emperor, Parisians had held their ground against seemingly impossible odds. The siege demonstrated the resilience and unity of ordinary citizens under inspired leadership, showing that local determination could repel even the most fearsome enemy. For centuries afterward, the event was remembered as the moment when Paris proved its importance as the heart of Francia. The city's growing reputation as a center of strength and survival laid the foundation for its future role as the capital of France. The siege was more than a military episode. It was a symbol of identity. Legacy in history and legend. Medieval chroniclers immortalized the Siege of Paris with dramatic flourishes, embellishing numbers and highlighting miraculous moments of survival. They describe Bishop Goslin dying a heroic warrior's death, Odo riding through enemy lines like a knight of legend, and citizens enduring famine with saintly faith. Over time, the siege entered legend, celebrated as one of the great confrontations of the Viking Age. While some details were exaggerated, the essence remained true. Paris had stood against overwhelming force and survived. The event shaped both French and Viking destinies, leading to the rise of Odo, the decline of Charles the Fat, and the eventual creation of Normandy. Its legacy was resilience, transformation, and the forging of medieval European identity.